I fear that the topic of Russian propaganda is still, despite everything that happened since February, I think it is still sometimes underestimated. The scope of the problem, how big the problem is, how many people it influences. I still think we are not exactly doing enough about the problem. Disinformation is for Russia a non-military measure how to achieve military goals. So when, for example, 300 Russian pseudo-journalists received medals from Vladimir Putin for objective coverage of Crimean events, meaning for lying that there is no Russian army in Crimea and that this is no annexation, or when 60 Russian journalists received medals from the Ministry of Defense for participating in the war in Syria, not for reporting, not for journalistic work, but for participating in the war. The Russian state is making clear that the so-called journalists, the pseudo-journalists, are part of the Russian military. They are helping Russian military goals. And I don't think that this is still fully appreciated in European countries. Currently, we are talking in a situation where the EU has sanctioned some of the Russian propaganda outlets, like Russia Today and Sputnik. Certainly not all of them. Many are still allowed. And still, already you would hear in some of the European countries the discussion like maybe we should already lift it, you know. And there is still not enough understanding how dangerous these channels can be and how big an influence they can get. When some of the opinion polls measure how effective Russian disinformation is, it is truly quite scary. 30% of Slovaks believing that the West is to blame for the war in Ukraine, not the country that amassed dozens of thousands of soldiers around Ukraine, not the country that is bombing civilians, bombing maternity wards, raping children, that it's somehow the West to blame for these atrocities, which is ridiculous. There was an opinion poll in Germany, and if you put together the answers yes and partly yes, it is again around 30% of people believing that it's the West to blame. So unfortunately, Russian propaganda can still achieve significant successes, and I'm afraid that the reaction still is not enough. It's not proportional. Russians are still putting more resources into this battle than Europe is. You know, the number one topic for Russian propaganda is by far Ukraine. This is really head and shoulders above the rest. When we were compiling the EU versus Disinfo database, my previous team in Brussels, you could see that Ukraine is like majority of it, and the number two topic would be probably United States. So Europe is probably somewhere in the third place. The disinformation is always trying to be like very targeted. So when you are trying to discredit the United States, you are trying to discredit Barack Obama, for example. Or when the KGB tried to discredit the Catholic Church, they were discrediting the Pope during World War II. I think his name was Pius XII, I'm not 100% sure. But you can Google it, who was the Pope during World War II. So even when you are trying to discredit some of the Western countries, they are trying to find specific figures. So what we saw when I was in Brussels with the EU versus Disinfo, immediately when Barack Obama left the office and Donald Trump came, Barack Obama suddenly, you couldn't use him as the number one scapegoat. So it became Angela Merkel as the symbol of the West. So I'm not sure they were trying to target Germany as a country. I think they were rather trying to target Angela Merkel as the representative of the unified Western response towards Russian disinformation, or Russian aggression in general, not just disinformation. Currently, I'm not even sure whether some of the European countries get more heat than the others. I mean, obviously, Baltic countries are always very high on the agenda. But it's not that different from how they are targeting the other so-called enemies of Russia. So I'm not really sure we could single out like one or two European countries. Maybe really the worst situation is for the Baltics. This was or still is one of my biggest concerns, that Russians are still outspending us in this particular domain. Not just with the money, but also with the human resources. the estimates how much Russia is putting in this disinformation influence are somewhere around $1.5 billion per year. But we are talking just about the so-called white propaganda, white sources, those sources that do not hide their attribution to Russia. But then you have all the sources that will tell you we are the only independent alternative to the lying mainstream media, but they are still spreading the same Russian propaganda. They just don't admit they are financed by Russia. And then you have the social media trolls, the famous troll factory. So all that is not in the sum of 1.5 billion. So the figure and all the work of the embassies, all the work of the secret services. So the figure is likely much, much higher. And now let's compare it to the EU response. My team, EU versus Disinfo, my previous team, EU versus Disinfo, in the first 2 years, the budget was zero. Then the budget was something like 1 million. So Russia was outspending us 1,500 to 1. Currently, the budget for the whole Stratcom division, which deals not only with Russian disinformation, but also with Chinese and other actors, is something like 12 million. So still, we are talking about like 100 or 150 to 1. So Russia is still heavily outspending us. They are not beating us with having a better message. Their message is not more attractive. They are not beating us because they would be so sophisticated about delivering the message. It is just sheer numbers. It is the brute force. It is the old Stalinist approach. Quantity is a quality of its own. And that's it. So I do not want to say that the EU is not doing anything. The EU is doing a lot. The trouble is that many of the initiatives are simply not big enough. That they don't have enough people, they don't have enough money. So I think it's like we are going in the right direction, we are just not moving fast enough, and Russia is still moving much faster. So we still have to do some catching up. So I think we are on the right track. We just need to really speed up, step up. Well, let me just state very clearly that unfortunately I'm not an expert on the region. However, I read about it. So from what I see, yeah, maybe let's start with like the general aim of Russian propaganda. It's this constant weakening of the enemy, whatever they perceive as the enemy. So that might be the West in general, that might be the EU, NATO, it might be the United States, the United Kingdom, but it also might be some of the countries in the region that they perceive as too pro-Western and not pro-Russian enough. So I can imagine a lot of the heat is consumed by Montenegro because they are a NATO member. I can imagine a lot of the heat will be targeted at Slovenia or Croatia because they are in NATO. And I presume a lot of it will be targeted at Kosovo because they are perceived as the biggest enemy or yeah, probably biggest enemy of Serbia. The aim of Russian disinformation will always be to try and play up the divisions in the society. And unfortunately, thanks to everything that happened in this region, there are many divisions you can be playing into. The ethnic divisions, the religious divisions, some of the historical grievances where almost every family has something they can grieve over what happened in the history. So unfortunately, there are like many aspects that Russia can target, significantly more than in countries that have lived in peace and prosperity in the past 7 decades. These societies will be, in the information domain, they will be more resilient, whereas the societies that had these traumas, they will be unfortunately less resilient, and it is unfortunately a bit easier for Russians to play into these grievances. What I also think is that Russia definitely has cultivated more local actors, local agents who will be helping them with their disinformation campaigns. This is something that Russia is trying to do in every country, but whereas in, for example, Finland, they will probably not be as successful, or in Estonia, they will probably not be as successful. I'm a bit afraid they might be more successful here in the Balkans. Again, it will probably have to do with the religious, ethnic, socio-economic divisions in the society. Just a few months ago, I published this report on countering disinformation, what needs to be done in order to effectively counter disinformation campaigns. And I came up with this concept of 4 lines of defense, that we need to be better at documenting of what is happening in the information space. We need to be better at repairing the weaknesses in the information space, raising awareness about disinformation campaigns, and finally in limiting, punishing, and deterring of the information aggressors. And if I take it from the point of view of the media can help documenting what is happening in the information space. How many disinformation channels are there? What are the messages they are spreading? You can also try and document how many people they persuade. This is a very interesting question, and sometimes when you start looking into the answers, it can be quite surprising. In Ukraine, a brilliant NGO, Detektor Media, they did this opinion poll back in 2017, 3 years after the annexation of Crimea. Started with the question, do you trust Russian media? 3 years after the invasion, you would have 99% of Ukrainians telling you, no, we don't. But then they started measuring whether people believe in the messages that are being spread by Russian media. For example, that Maidan revolution was an illegal coup d'etat. And suddenly you would have 1/3 of the population believing in this narrative. It's a little bit like people telling you that we don't read tabloids, but then everybody knows what's in the tabloids, right? It's a little bit similar mechanism. And so measuring how many people believe in what disinformation narratives, this gives you a very important information about how big trouble are you facing. Then the raising awareness, again, very crucial. The media can really help here. Explaining to the audiences what is disinformation, what does it look like, what is it trying to achieve, and who is helping it, who are the local facilitators of the disinformation campaigns. That is important. Then repairing some of the weaknesses. Unfortunately, what we have seen even in some of the Western media is that despite everything that happened, you would still see some of the Western media portraying Russian version of events as somehow equal to what the Ukrainians are saying. So this he says, she says journalism, you know. Ukrainians say this, Russians say this, and you, the reader, decide what is true, which is horrible in my opinion. If you present the Russian version of events, and you don't remind the reader that these are the people who lied about annexation of Crimea, they lied about shooting down MH17, they lied about poisoning Skripal and Navalny, they lied about state-sponsored doping, they lied about the massacre of Bucha. If you don't remind the reader about that, you are misleading the reader. That's a bad job. You really have to remind the reader about the credibility, or the lack of these particular speakers. So I think the media could still be doing a little bit better job. When it comes to the final line of defense, this limiting, punishing, and deterring, it's probably not that much up to the media. I think this is mainly up to the authorities to come up with the sanctions against the disinformers, for example, to try and limit the influx of money, for example, that Western media would stop financing the anti-Western propaganda on Russian state channels. So this is probably not up to the media. But maybe one element, the media can at least name and shame those who are spreading Russian disinformation for the local audiences. And this is something that is probably better done by media and civil society rather than the government. When the government does that, it looks like a witch hunt, you know, against political opponents or something. But here the media and the civil society have probably a bit more free hand. So I think this is something where the media could help as well.